John Titor materialized in online discussion forums with an extraordinary claim that would have gotten him laughed off the internet if not for what happened next. He wasn't just another conspiracy theorist or attention-seeking hoaxer. He was, according to his posts, a soldier from the year 2036 sent back in time on a military mission to retrieve specific computer technology from 1975. But his mission had brought him through our timeline, and he decided to share what he knew about our immediate future. What made Titor different from every other alleged time traveler was the sheer volume and specificity of information he provided. He didn't just make vague predictions about coming changes. He delivered technical blueprints for his time machine, explained the mechanics of temporal displacement using advanced physics, and described the socio-political landscape of the early 21st century with an accuracy that becomes more chilling with each passing year. Writing between 2000 and 2001, months before September 11th changed everything, Titor warned that Americans would willingly surrender constitutional freedoms in exchange for security after experiencing domestic terrorism on an unprecedented scale. He described a future where federal police actions would increase dramatically, where surveillance would become pervasive, and where the country would split along urban and rural lines in ways that seemed impossible during the relatively peaceful Clinton years. His technical knowledge was equally impressive and equally impossible to explain. He accurately described capabilities of the IBM 5100 computer that weren't publicly known until years after his posts disappeared. When questioned about specific technical details, he provided information that computer engineers later confirmed was correct, but wasn't available in public documentation when he was posting. A former IBM engineer named Bob Dubker later verified that only a handful of people knew about these hidden functions when Titor was active online. But it was his predictions about technology that truly set him apart from typical internet prophets. In 2000, when most people were still using dial-up modems and carrying pagers, Titor described a world where everyone would carry powerful computers in their pockets. He talked about global communication networks that would allow instant contact with anyone on Earth, social media platforms that would reshape human interaction, and information systems so advanced they would fundamentally alter how society operates. He wasn't describing these as distant possibilities or science fiction concepts. He was describing them as historical facts from his perspective, technologies that were already outdated in his 2036 timeline. His descriptions of smartphones, social networking, and internet-based commerce were so accurate they read like product reviews written 15 years before those products existed. Perhaps most disturbing of all were his warnings about the psychological and social costs of these technological advances. Writing in 2001, he predicted that these communication technologies would create new forms of addiction and social isolation, that people would become dependent on constant digital stimulation, and that real-world human connections would deteriorate as virtual connections multiplied. Anyone living in 2024 can see how precisely these predictions materialized. Titor's posts also contained ominous warnings about political polarization in America. He described a second civil war beginning around 2005, sparked by federal overreach and constitutional violations following a major terrorist attack. While his timeline was compressed, the social divisions he predicted between urban and rural populations, the rise of federal police powers, and the gradual erosion of constitutional protections have manifested with startling accuracy over the past 2 decades. His understanding of physics was equally advanced for someone posting in internet forums. He explained concepts related to quantum mechanics, parallel universes, and temporal mechanics with a sophistication that impressed physicists who encountered his posts. His descriptions of how time travel would work incorporated many worlds, interpretation of quantum physics, and addressed paradox problems in ways that wouldn't become mainstream theoretical discussion for years afterward. The photographs he provided showed what appeared to be his time travel device installed in a 1987 Chevrolet Suburban, The images demonstrated technical sophistication that would have been extremely difficult to fabricate convincingly in 2000. The device appeared to be a complex arrangement of electromagnetic field generators with detailed technical specifications that suggested genuine engineering rather than science fiction props. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, John Titor vanished from the forums in March 2001. His final post stated that his mission was complete and he would be leaving this timeline shortly. He thanked the online communities that had engaged with him and warned that the future he described wasn't inevitable, that individual choices and collective actions could still alter the trajectory he had witnessed. 23 years later, the accuracy of Titor's predictions becomes more unsettling with each news cycle. The surveillance state he described has materialized exactly as he warned. The social media platforms he predicted have reshaped civilization in precisely the ways he outlined. The political polarization and constitutional erosion he forecast have accelerated beyond what even pessimists imagined possible in 2001. Skeptics argue that Titor was simply an astute observer of emerging trends who packaged educated guesses in an entertaining time travel narrative. They point out that some of his more dramatic predictions, like open civil war by 2015, didn't materialize exactly as described. But supporters counter that his core insights about technology, society, and politics have proven remarkably prescient, and that his timeline might have been affected by his own intervention in our past. What makes the Titor case particularly compelling is not just the accuracy of individual predictions, but the comprehensive worldview he presented. He didn't just guess that smartphones would be invented. He described an entire technological and social ecosystem that wouldn't emerge for more than a decade, complete with psychological effects and societal consequences that are now undeniably real. The investigation into Titor's true identity has revealed tantalizing clues, but no definitive answers. Some evidence points to an elaborate hoax orchestrated by entertainment lawyers in Florida, but the technical knowledge displayed in his posts suggests involvement by someone with advanced computer science and physics expertise. The sheer volume of detailed, consistent information provided over 2 years of posting indicates either an extraordinarily sophisticated hoax or something far more extraordinary. Our next case takes us from the digital realm into physical reality, where documented evidence challenges our understanding of how past and present can intersect in impossible ways. In the summer of 1950, New York City witnessed something that would haunt investigators for decades and force them to question the very nature of reality itself. What started as a routine traffic accident in Times Square became one of the most documented cases of temporal displacement ever recorded, complete with physical evidence that defies every rational explanation. The victim was a man named Rudolph Fentz, struck and killed by a taxi on a busy Thursday evening in June. Under normal circumstances, this would have been just another tragic statistic in a city where pedestrian accidents were unfortunately common. But when police searched the body, they discovered something that turned a simple traffic fatality into an impossible mystery that challenges everything we think we know about time. Fentz was dressed in clothing that belonged in a different century. He wore a black frock coat, button-up boots, and a vest with a gold pocket watch, all appearing to be from the 1870s. Yet these weren't costume pieces or vintage reproductions. The clothing showed no signs of age, wear, or the kind of deterioration you'd expect from 80-year-old garments. Everything looked brand new, as if it had just been tailored. His pockets contained items that deepened the mystery exponentially. There were brass buttons, a copper token for a free beer at a tavern that had been demolished in 1876, and $70 in banknotes that had been out of circulation for decades. Most puzzling was what he didn't have. No identification from the modern era, no wallet contents connecting him to 1950, and no signs of mental illness or confusion that might explain his anachronistic appearance. Witnesses described Fentz as looking around Times Square with complete bewilderment, as if seeing the modern cityscape for the first time. His behavior suggested someone genuinely disoriented by his surroundings, rather than someone playing an elaborate practical joke. He stepped directly into traffic as if unaware of how dangerous automobiles could be, moving with the careful deliberation of someone unfamiliar with modern transportation. Captain Hubert Rhyme of the Missing Persons Bureau decided to investigate what should have been an open and shut case. What he discovered in the department's old records defied every law of logic and causality. In the missing persons files from 1876, he found an entry for Rudolph Fentz, aged 29, who had vanished without a trace during an evening walk near his home. The description matched the accident victim perfectly, down to the smallest physical details. Height, weight, hair color, facial features, even specific scars and birthmarks aligned exactly between the 1876 missing person and the 1950 traffic fatality. The mathematical probability of such precise physical correspondence occurring by chance approaches statistical impossibility. Rhyme's investigation revealed even more disturbing evidence. In the 1939 New York phone directory, there was a listing for Rudolph Fentz Jr. When contacted, this man claimed his father had mysteriously disappeared in 1876 during a routine evening walk and was never seen again. He provided a photograph of his missing father that was identical to the man killed in Times Square, creating a generational connection that spans nearly 3/4 of a century. The physical evidence presented problems that forensic science couldn't adequately explain. The clothing, while appearing to be from the 1870s, showed no signs of aging, moth damage, or the chemical deterioration that would be inevitable after decades of storage. The fabric retained dyes and textures that suggested recent manufacture, yet the styles and construction methods were authentically Victorian. The banknotes presented their own impossibilities. Currency experts confirmed they were genuine legal tender from the appropriate historical period, not reproductions or collector's items. Yet the bills showed minimal wear, despite supposedly being carried for 74 years. The paper quality and printing characteristics matched 1870s Treasury standards perfectly, but the preservation state suggested recent printing rather than antique currency. Most disturbing was the copper beer token, which bore the name of a tavern that had operated in Lower Manhattan during the 1870s. Historical records confirmed the establishment's existence and its demolition in 1876, but the token itself appeared newly minted rather than aged. Metallurgical analysis revealed copper composition and manufacturing techniques consistent with 19th century methods, yet without the corrosion and wear patterns expected from a token carried for decades. The case was quietly filed away and forgotten by official channels, deemed too strange and inexplicable for public consumption. But retired police officers who worked the investigation continued to discuss it privately for decades afterward. They had witnessed physical evidence that challenged fundamental assumptions about time, causality, and the nature of reality itself. Medical examination of Fentz's body revealed additional anomalies that deepened the mystery. His dental work was consistent with 19th century techniques, using materials and methods that had been abandoned by modern dentistry. His physical condition suggested someone accustomed to the lifestyle and diet of the 1870s rather than mid-20th century living. Even his callus patterns and muscle development indicated manual labour typical of the Victorian era. The psychological profile, constructed from witness statements, painted a picture of genuine temporal displacement rather than elaborate deception. Fentz exhibited none of the behavioural markers associated with mental illness, drug intoxication, or deliberate fraud. His reactions to modern Times Square suggested authentic amazement and confusion rather than performed bewilderment. What makes the Fentz case particularly compelling is the convergence of multiple independent evidence streams. The missing persons report from 1876, the physical evidence from 1950, and the testimony from his descendant in 1939 create a triangle of documentation that would be nearly impossible to fabricate convincingly. Each piece of evidence supports the others in ways that suggest genuine temporal anomaly rather than coordinated hoax. Skeptics have attempted to explain the case through conventional means, proposing everything from elaborate practical jokes to cases of mistaken identity involving historical reenactors. However, none of these explanations adequately account for the physical evidence, the historical documentation, or the precise correspondence between the missing person from 1876 and the accident victim from 1950. The fence incident represents something far more disturbing than simple time travel. It suggests that individuals can become unstuck from their proper temporal location and transported across decades with their physical forms intact, but their context completely disrupted. The case implies that time might not be the fixed, linear progression we assume, but something far more fluid and unpredictable. Our third case takes us across the Atlantic to the Gardens of Versailles, where two respected academics experienced something that would challenge their understanding of history, reality, and the boundaries between past and present. What they witnessed during a simple afternoon walk would become one of the most thoroughly documented and credible cases of temporal displacement ever recorded. In August 1901, Eleanor Jourdain and Charlotte Moberly, both distinguished scholars from Oxford, decided to explore the famous gardens surrounding the Palace of Versailles during a vacation in France. Both women were highly educated, skeptical by nature, and trained in rigorous academic methodology. They approached their afternoon stroll with the same intellectual curiosity they brought to their scholarly work. What began as a leisurely tourist excursion became an encounter with the past so vivid and detailed that it would consume both women for the next decade as they attempted to verify and understand what they had experienced. The evidence they gathered would challenge conventional understanding of time, memory, and historical reality in ways that continue to baffle researchers more than a century later. As they walked through the gardens, both women began to notice subtle changes in their environment that defied logical explanation. The atmosphere became oppressive and dreamlike, as if they had stepped through an invisible barrier into a different realm entirely. Colours around them seemed to fade and take on the muted tones of an old painting. An inexplicable feeling of melancholy settled over them, accompanied by a sensation that they were being watched by unseen observers. The first concrete evidence that something extraordinary was happening came when they encountered people dressed in elaborate 18th century clothing who seemed to be going about their daily activities as if nothing unusual was occurring. These weren't costumed tour guides or historical reenactors. The individuals they met moved with the natural confidence of people in their proper time and place, completely unaware that anything strange was happening. Near the Petit Trianon, they observed a woman sitting on the grass, sketching with focused concentration. She looked up at them with mild curiosity, before returning to her artistic work. The woman's clothing, hairstyle, and overall appearance matched historical descriptions of Marie Antoinette with uncanny precision. More importantly, the location where they encountered her was exactly where historical records indicated the doomed queen would spend her summer afternoons during the final years before the French Revolution. The architectural environment they observed presented equally impossible evidence. Buildings that had been demolished decades before 1901 appeared solid and functional. Gardens that had been redesigned multiple times since the 18th century displayed their original 1789 layout with perfect accuracy. Paths that no longer existed in their time period stretched before them, as if freshly maintained by royal groundskeepers. They encountered gardeners working with tools that belonged to a different century, using techniques and equipment that had been abandoned by modern landscape maintenance. The workers acknowledged their presence with the casual politeness typical of servants accustomed to encountering nobility and visitors in the royal gardens. None seemed surprised by the appearance of two English women in Victorian dress. Most striking was their interaction with a man in a dark cloak who warned them away from a certain direction with urgent gestures. They would later realize this individual bore an exact resemblance to the Comte de Vaudreuil, one of Marie Antoinette's courtiers whose detailed portraits survived in historical archives. His clothing, mannerisms, and even his facial features matched documented descriptions with photographic precision. When they returned to their hotel that evening, both women were profoundly shaken by what they had experienced. Being trained academics, they immediately began a systematic investigation that would consume the next decade of their lives. They interviewed historians, studied 18th century maps of Versailles, and compared their memories against historical records with the same rigor they applied to their university research. What they discovered was even more unsettling than their original experience. Every detail they had observed could be verified as historically accurate to the summer of 1789, just months before the French Revolution would sweep away the world they had apparently visited. Their knowledge of architectural details, garden layouts, and specific individuals corresponded exactly to private archives that weren't publicly available in 1901. The paths they had walked matched historical plans stored in restricted collections. The buildings they had seen existed precisely as described in confidential palace records. Even the placement of specific trees and garden features aligned with 18th century landscaping documents that required special permission to access. Their descriptions demonstrated knowledge that would have been impossible to acquire through conventional research methods available at the time. Most compelling was their separate documentation of the experience. Without consulting each other, both women wrote detailed accounts of what they had witnessed, then compared their independent recollections. The correspondence was remarkable, not just in broad details, but in minute specifics that suggested they had genuinely shared the same impossible experience rather than influenced each other's memories. The French authorities took their claims seriously enough to launch their own investigation. Official researchers confirmed that the women had accurately described features of Versailles that had existed in 1789 but had been changed or removed by 1901. The precision of their historical knowledge impressed even skeptical government officials, who had initially dismissed their account as tourist fantasy or academic delusion. Independent verification came from architectural historians who found that Jourdain and Moberly had described structural details that appeared in no public documents but were confirmed by private palace records. Their account included information about room layouts, decorative elements, and even specific furniture arrangements that matched archived inventories from the period they claimed to have visited. The psychological profiles of both women added credibility to their extraordinary claims. Neither had histories of mental illness, substance abuse, or tendency toward fantasy. Both were respected academics with reputations for rigorous scholarship and critical thinking. Their colleagues at Oxford confirmed that they approached this investigation with the same methodical skepticism they applied to their professional work. What made their case particularly compelling was the emotional authenticity of their experience. Both women described feeling genuine sadness and foreboding while in the past, emotions that aligned perfectly with the historical moment they claimed to have witnessed. They had encountered Marie Antoinette during her final summer of relative freedom, just months before the revolution would destroy her world forever. The sensory details they recorded suggested direct experience rather than imaginative reconstruction. They described specific sounds, smells, and tactile sensations that indicated physical presence in the 18th century environment. The quality of light, the texture of gravel paths, even the particular fragrance of period gardens were documented with precision that suggested genuine sensory memory rather than historical speculation. Skeptics attempted to explain their experience through conventional psychology, proposing everything from shared hallucination to cryptomnesia, where forgotten historical knowledge resurfaces as apparent memory. However, none of these explanations adequately accounted for the specific accuracy of their observations, or the independent verification of details that weren't available through normal research channels. The publication of their account in 1911 sparked international debate among psychologists, historians, and philosophers. Supporters argued that their academic credentials and methodical investigation demanded serious consideration. Critics maintained that no amount of scholarly rigor could validate such an impossible claim, regardless of the evidence presented. But the physical evidence remained stubbornly inexplicable. Their impossible knowledge of 18th century Versailles, verified through multiple independent sources, suggested they had somehow accessed information that existed only in the past itself. Whether through time travel, psychic vision, or some unknown mechanism, they had encountered historical reality with a precision that conventional explanation cannot adequately address. Our fourth case brings us to the realm of literature and prophecy, where creative imagination intersected with future tragedy in ways so precise they challenge our understanding of how fiction relates to reality. What happened here involves one of America's greatest writers and a prediction so specific it would later be dismissed as impossible coincidence, except the details are too exact for mathematical comfort. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only complete novel, a maritime adventure called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. The book contained a gruesome scene that would prove prophetic in the most disturbing way imaginable. Poe described 4 shipwrecked sailors, starving and desperate on a lifeboat, making the horrific decision to resort to cannibalism for survival. In Poe's fictional account, the men drew lots to determine who would be sacrificed to save the others. The victim was a young cabin boy named Richard Parker, who was killed and consumed by his 3 companions. It was dark fiction from the mind of America's master of macabre literature, designed to explore the psychological extremes of human desperation and moral collapse. 46 years later, reality would mirror Poe's imagination with precision so chilling it defies every rational explanation for coincidence. In 1884, an English yacht called the Mignonette set sail from Southampton bound for Sydney, Australia. During the voyage, the vessel encountered a massive storm in the South Atlantic and sank, leaving 4 crew members adrift in a small lifeboat with virtually no supplies. The survivors were Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and 17-year-old cabin boy Richard Parker. Yes, you heard that name correctly. Richard Parker, the exact same name as Poe's fictional victim, written nearly half a century before this real tragedy, would unfold in the middle of the ocean. Adrift for weeks with no food and minimal fresh water, the 4 men grew increasingly desperate. They managed to catch an occasional turtle, but it wasn't nearly enough to sustain them. The young cabin boy, Richard Parker, became ill after drinking seawater in his desperation. Seeing that the boy was near death, Captain Dudley proposed the unthinkable. They should kill Richard Parker and consume his body to save themselves. After agonizing debate, they committed the act exactly as Poe had described in his fictional account. Parker was killed, and the remaining 3 men fed on his corpse. They were rescued just days later by a passing ship, thousands of miles from any land. The subsequent legal case became a landmark in English law, establishing the precedent that necessity is not a legal defense for murder. The parallels between Poe's fiction and the real Mignonette disaster are so precise, they push the boundaries of statistical possibility into supernatural territory. Both involved 4 men on a lifeboat. Both featured a cabin boy named Richard Parker as the victim. Both described identical circumstances leading to cannibalism. Both occurred in the same general ocean region under nearly identical conditions. What makes this case particularly disturbing is that Poe had no possible way of knowing these specific details would manifest in reality decades later. He couldn't have predicted that someone with the precise name of his fictional victim would find himself in identical circumstances facing the same horrific fate. Yet somehow his dark imagination became prophetic reality with surgical accuracy that defies rational explanation. The mathematical odds of this specific name appearing in both the fictional and real versions of this exact scenario are beyond astronomical. Poe created Richard Parker from his imagination in 1838. The real Richard Parker was born years after the novel was published, given a name that would later seal his fate in circumstances identical to those Poe had invented. This coincidence forces us to confront deeply unsettling questions about the relationship between imagination and reality. Can creative minds sometimes access information about future events through mechanisms we don't understand? Do certain tragic patterns repeat themselves across time with mathematical precision? Or did Poe somehow tap into a darker truth about human nature that made his fictional scenario inevitable? Our fifth case involves a man who seemed cosmically synchronized with one of the most famous celestial objects in our solar system, demonstrating a connection between human consciousness and astronomical events that challenges everything we think we know about fate and coincidence. Mark Twain was born on November 30th, 1835, just 2 weeks after the appearance of Halley's Comet. This famous celestial visitor, visible from Earth only once every 75 to 76 years, was making one of its rare appearances when Samuel Clemens entered the world. Twain grew up knowing about this cosmic connection and felt a deep personal bond with the comet that had marked his birth. As he aged, America's beloved humorist began making what seemed like outrageous predictions about his own death. In 1909, he was quoted making a statement that would prove prophetically accurate in the most impossible way. He declared that he had come into the world with Halley's Comet in 1835 and expected to go out with it when it returned. He said it would be the greatest disappointment of his life if he didn't die when the comet made its next appearance. Twain claimed that the Almighty had created two unaccountable freaks, himself and the comet, and that they came in together and must go out together. Most people dismiss this as typical Twain humor, the kind of witty observation that made him famous. Nobody expected the universe to take him seriously. The cosmos decided to grant his wish with timing so precise it seems orchestrated by forces beyond human comprehension. Mark Twain died of a heart attack on April 21st, 1910. Halley's Comet had made its closest approach to Earth the day before, on April 20th. He literally came in with the comet and went out with it, exactly as he had predicted a year earlier. This wasn't just a case of someone making a lucky guess about their death. This represents a man who seemed to understand his cosmic connection to a celestial object and accurately predicted the timing of his own demise based on that connection. The mathematical odds of this prediction coming true with such precision are staggering, especially considering the comet's 75-year cycle. What makes Twain's cosmic coincidence even more remarkable is his apparent awareness of the pattern before it completed itself. He didn't just experience a synchronicity after the fact. He predicted it publicly, announced it to the world, and then lived to see it fulfilled with astronomical precision. This suggests some people might be born with an intuitive understanding of their place in the cosmic order. Our sixth mind-breaking case takes us into the realm of genetics and human behavior in ways that fundamentally challenge everything we believe about free will and individual choice. What you're about to discover will make you question whether the decisions you think you're making independently are actually predetermined by forces beyond your control. In 1940, identical twin boys were born in Ohio and separated at just a few weeks old. They were adopted by different families who had no knowledge of each other's existence. Both adoptive families, by pure coincidence, decided to name their new son James. One became James Springer, the other James Lewis. For 39 years, these two men lived completely separate lives, unaware that an identical version of themselves existed somewhere in the world. When they were finally reunited in 1979, what they discovered defied every rational explanation for human behavior and personal choice. The similarities went far beyond what genetics could reasonably explain. Both James twins were exactly 6 feet tall and weighed 180 pounds. During childhood, both had owned dogs named Toy. Both excelled at mathematics, but struggled with spelling in school. Both enjoyed woodworking as hobbies and showed talent for mechanical drawing. These parallels might be explained by shared genetics, But what happened next pushes coincidence into supernatural territory. Both men had married women named Linda. Both had divorced their wives named Linda and subsequently married women named Betty. Both had sons whom they named James Allen, though one spelled the middle name differently as Allen. The career parallels were equally impossible to explain through conventional understanding of human development. Both worked part-time as sheriff's deputies, despite growing up in different states, with no communication between their adoptive families. Both were chain smokers who preferred Salem cigarettes. Both drove light blue Chevrolet automobiles of the same model and year. The medical synchronicities reached levels that challenged everything scientists thought they knew about genetics and environment. Both suffered from tension headaches that began at exactly the same age. Both were compulsive nail-biters who exhibited identical nervous habits. Both had gained and lost exactly 10 pounds at the same point in their adult lives, following weight patterns that mirrored each other with mathematical precision. Even their leisure activities showed impossible coordination across decades of separation. Both took vacations at the same small beach resort in Florida, sometimes during the same weeks, without ever encountering each other. They stayed at the same hotels, visited the same attractions, and followed nearly identical vacation routines while living hundreds of miles apart. These weren't just surface-level similarities or coincidental preferences. These represented life choices, medical conditions, and behavioral patterns that seemed to be encoded in their DNA with a specificity that science couldn't adequately explain. The Jim twins became subjects of intensive study at the University of Minnesota, where researchers investigated how genetics influence human behavior. Their case provided compelling evidence that our genes control far more of our lives than anyone had previously imagined. From career choices and hobbies to the names we give our children and the brands we prefer, the Jim twins suggested that free will might be far more limited than we want to believe. What makes their story even more unsettling is the implication that our most personal decisions might not be personal at all. If identical genetics can lead to marrying women with the same names, choosing identical career paths, developing the same medical problems, and even naming children identically, what does that say about human individuality and the choices we think we're making independently? The psychological implications extend beyond individual behavior into questions about consciousness itself. Were both James twins making conscious decisions that happened to align perfectly, or were they following predetermined patterns written into their genetic code? The distinction becomes meaningless when the results are identical across every measurable category of human experience. These 10 cases force us to confront the most fundamental questions about reality itself. Whether we're witnessing evidence of hidden patterns governing our universe, forces beyond comprehension, orchestrating events with mathematical precision, or glimpses of how time actually operates beneath the surface, remains an open question. What's certain is that these stories challenge everything we thought we knew about coincidence, fate, and the nature of existence. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is that these aren't rare exceptions to reality's rules, but windows into a universe far stranger and more mysteriously interconnected than our limited perspective allows us to understand.